Hi everyone, nice to see you all again. Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about how and why and when I studied Japanese. Japanese was the first language that I ever studied seriously. It was the first language I studied that I actually gave a about. I started studying it when I was 19 at university. Japanese Studies was the name of the course. I did Japanese studies at the University of Sheffield, and that was in the late 90s. It was in the late 90s that I started studying Japanese. Up until that point in time, I had studied French at school against my will, Welsh at school against my will. The less said about that, the better, I think. I grew up in Wales, in case you're wondering why I would have studied Welsh. I wish I'd paid a bit more attention, actually, in Welsh class. It'd be nice to know a bit of Welsh, but there you go. I'd also studied a little bit of Spanish, just 3 months or something, and I had really not had any interest in it. So, when I started studying Japanese, I'd never made any effort to learn any language at all. That's actually one of the reasons that I decided to do it. I was one of these kids who studied maths, physics, chemistry at school in Britain for my A levels. That's high school for those of you who don't know our system. And I didn't want to continue along those lines. I didn't want to go into science or maths. But I was going to go to university, because people of a certain social background tend to go to university in Britain, like in many other countries. So I had to decide what to study, and I decided to take a crack at Japanese. I thought maybe I should try studying a language seriously. So I started studying Japanese, and I realized quite quickly, my level, by the way, was just 0 when I started. I knew like 3 sentences, how to put 3 different sentences together in Japanese. So I was really starting from scratch. That's why it's a 4-year course and not a 3-year course. If you do French language and literature at university in Britain, it'll be 3 years by default. I don't know, maybe 4 if you go abroad for a year. But Japanese, Russian, Chinese, Korean, undoubtedly Arabic, Slavonic studies if you want to do Russian and Polish or something. These courses will always be 4 years. And I was doing a 4-year course. So I started studying Japanese, and I quickly realized that I liked it. Surprise, surprise, I liked it a lot. And at least insofar as I could judge on the basis of the other people who were studying with me on my course, I seemed to be pretty good at it. Because with a course like that, a lot of people drop it very quickly. A lot of people fall by the wayside very quickly, either because they can't do it, or because they realize that it's not for them. They don't want to spend years learning some weirdo Asian language. So people kind of drop like flies, but I liked it. And I realized quite quickly that I wanted to spend a lot of time working on it. I wanted to really go for it and study it intensively. In the beginning, it's not that clear how you should go about doing that. The world has changed a great deal. Back then, I only found out that the internet existed when I got to university. One of the guys I was living with in my accommodation, he said, "Hey, have you heard about this thing you can go and access in the computer room on campus?" I was like, "No, what is it?" That was the internet. It was pretty primitive then. There were some pages, but if you weren't alive then, it would be difficult for you to understand what the internet was like. There was no YouTube. Trust me, there was no YouTube. So it was difficult to figure out a way of getting access to things that people would take for granted today. Most obviously, audio. Secondarily, speaking opportunities, Skype, italki, FaceTime, whatever you want. Online language exchange. No, this stuff didn't exist. So when I realized that I wanted to really crack on hard with my Japanese and try and get good at it, I realized, and this is, a lot of people think that you should just learn a load of kanji right at the beginning of this language learning process. I want to say more about that in another video, because it can be a bad idea, but in my case it was a good idea. Let me explain. I realized that Japanese grammar was so alien with respect to English grammar that if I tried to start cramming it by myself in the early stages, I was probably going to misinternalize things. I was probably going to get confused. But learning kanji is basically rote learning, right? you can't get confused in the same kind of way. You get one of these books and you learn the kanji and you learn the onyomi and the kunyomi, and you start learning different compounds and you start trying to write these things, because we had to write them as part of my course. There was no choice in the matter. And I knew that if I cracked on with this, I wasn't going to get into trouble. I thought, I'll wait a few months. I'm studying the grammar as part of my course. That's all there in the background. Had a couple of conversation lessons a week, although we couldn't converse at that stage. At that stage, it was more an opportunity just to say a few things and hear a bit of Japanese, right? Anyway, I'm rambling. I decided that I was going to put my surplus energies and time into learning kanji. I learned a lot. By the end of the year, I had something like 1,600 flashcards. Real, physical flashcards. None of this Anki stuff. I had real cards. And I stopped at about 1,600. Because I realized, as people inevitably do eventually, that once you reach a certain point, it's not about learning kanji, it's about learning to read Japanese. And once you've got that springboard, once you've learned over 1,000 kanji, you should just read stuff and pick up new characters and new words as you go along. So that's where I focused my energies. And indeed, as I got towards the end of my first year, this understanding, this mental picture as to how Japanese grammar worked started to really take shape and become robust. So then I was happier to read ahead myself in our textbooks, let's say, for lack of a better expression, and start, I don't want to say cramming because it implies something that I don't want to imply, but I started to accelerate the speed at which I learned Japanese grammar. Then at the beginning of my second year, I decided that it was time to start trying to speak Japanese a bit. Like I said, we had a couple of conversation classes a week, but you know, you've got 5 or 6 people in a class, you don't get any time to really speak. These classes are very structured, you're not really put on the spot. I decided it was time to jump in at the deep end. So basically I went to an English language school in Sheffield that had kind of not advertised really, but that had put a notice up on the notice board in my department and said, hey, we've got Japanese students, do you want to come and talk to them, get some language exchange in? So I started doing things like that. And I met some people that I liked and who hopefully liked me, and we started to hang out, we became friends. Friends of mine off my course started coming with us. So there was a real social element to this process of learning Japanese now, and that's really important. And you know, maybe a couple of times a week, would depend on what we were doing, but a couple of times a week, we'd meet up, we'd spend some time together, sometimes even a few hours speaking English, Japanese, and I started to improve quite a lot. Actually, I started to improve quite rapidly. I was studying intensively the whole time. My basic study pattern was to do whatever I would normally do during the day with my Japanese, and then do a good 3, maybe even sometimes 4 hours of study at night in the evening, late in the evening. And I was doing that right through my second year. I would get these readers out of the university library. You'd have a text. The text was designed to teach you new stuff. It would have a glossary. You'd learn the new words. They'd pull the interesting new grammar points out of the text. They'd highlight them, give you sample sentences. I'd write this stuff down, write down whatever looked interesting. And I did a lot of that stuff. That second year in particular was probably kind of crucial actually in my studies of Japanese. That was when I went from being someone who had some knowledge of Japanese to someone who actually understood it quite well in some sense. A very steep learning curve. There was still so much to learn. Because in the early stages you think you learn the grammar and the words and then you read a sentence and you can understand it, whereas the reality is that often you know the grammar and the words and you still can't understand what the sentence means. That's experience. It takes a lot of exposure to start getting the hang of that kind of thing. I went to Japan for the first time for about 2-3 months at the end of that at the end of that second year. And I got a lot of practice, a lot of exposure. That was good. That was the first time I'd ever been to Japan. And then my third year was more of the same, plus we had a 4-month study tour. I was at the University of Kanazawa for 4 months. My third year was quite similar to my second year in terms of the type of study that I did. And you're just improving gradually the whole time. There's no magic bullet or anything. The great handicap here was listening comprehension. You know, I joined the anime club at university. Once a week you'd go and listen to anime for 60, 90 minutes, whatever it may have been. There was a room in the department I was in where basically whenever there was a Japanese film on the TV, they would record it on a VHS. Back in the good old days when they had real videos. They had built up a little library of films. I would regularly go and sit in there and watch Japanese films. Wow, people don't know how fortunate they are today with YouTube and everything. The difference is incredible. That more than anything would have made a difference. Easy access to high quality listening material. That would have when you're at a university, you've got all the books you need, you've got all the reading material you need. It's the listening that was hard back in the 90s. It was just so hard to get hold of anything. Then in my final year, 3 months into my final year, I sat the JLPT EQ, as it was called then. What is it now? N5? They call it N5, right? Whatever they call it. It was the hardest one. I passed that quite easily, actually. I got 90%. I'm not bragging. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a pass mark. My Japanese was quite good by then, but it wasn't that good. When I graduated at the end, obviously, of my 4th year, there was a brief delay of a couple of months, and then I went back to Japan to live, to get a job. And then when I started socializing a lot with Japanese people, my Japanese really continued to improve a lot. This is why I say that mark of 90% on your N5 or JLPT EQ, it doesn't mean that much, actually. It's nice. It's nice to pass it. It's better than failing it, but it doesn't mean that much. I spent about, over the next few years, I spent about 3 years in total in Japan. So between the ages of 23 and probably 29 or 30, let's say between the ages of 23 and 30, I spent a total of about 3.5 years in Japan. So I spent half of that time in Japan. Most of it when I was there working as a translator, translating financial documents from Japanese into English. And then my exposure to Japanese gradually tailed off after I left Japan. If italki and things like that had existed then, I would probably have continued to speak Japanese, but they didn't. So my exposure to Japanese tailed off more or less to watching quite a lot of anime sometimes, watching Japanese films sometimes. Didn't really read anything in Japanese. Reading Japanese to me was like work, because that's what I'd done at work. I'd read Japanese and I didn't really want to do it anymore. Even today I don't particularly enjoy reading Japanese. To me, a language is what comes out of people's mouths, to be honest. So to the extent that I wanted to retain a certain amount of exposure to Japanese, I listened to it, watching mainly anime, like I said, and sometimes films. And over a period of time, my exposure to Japanese just tailed off. When I say a period of time, I mean quite a long time, I mean a decade or whatever. But that connection gradually is lost. It's lost. That psychological connection with Japan is lost. And then a few years ago, maybe 6 years ago now, something like that, I went through a period of maybe 18 months, 2 years when I studied Japanese again. I must have done something like 800, 1,000 hours of study over a period of, like I said, 18 months, 2 years. And my Japanese started to improve a bit again, and then I just stopped. It seemed like an inordinate effort to try and maintain my level of ability in a language with which I never seem to have lost that much ability in the first place. My Japanese didn't seem to deteriorate that much over time, even when I wasn't speaking it. Of course, my active vocabulary suffered a bit, but even today, when I speak Japanese, I just open my mouth and it seems to come out. And if I struggle because I can't think of a word that I would have known 15 years ago, then that's too bad. That's life. I can't sink huge amounts of time into my Japanese just so that occasionally I know the right word. I don't speak Japanese in my day-to-day life. Sometimes I speak it a bit with my students, but that's it. I don't have any reason to speak it. So unless something changes radically in the future, I can't imagine that I'll put any particular time or energy into studying or maintaining my Japanese. That's it. There's a lot more that I could say, but this video is already long enough. If you have any questions, if you want to ask me anything about how I studied Japanese or how I studied any other language that I can speak, then by all means drop me a line in the comments and let me know. But that's it. Thanks very much. I appreciate you coming by, and ciao ciao. Bye bye.